You know what really gets me about Frozen? Everyone talks about Elsa's ice powers like they're the real problem, but honestly, I think we've been looking at this completely wrong. Picture this. You're watching Elsa's coronation, and she's standing there, trembling. The crown is too heavy, her hands are shaking, and when she tries to hold the royal orb, ice starts creeping across it. Most people see magical anxiety, but what if I told you what you're actually witnessing is a textbook PTSD episode? Here's what I noticed when I really studied that scene. Elsa isn't just nervous about being queen. She's having a full-blown trauma response. Think about it. She's surrounded by people. Everyone's staring at her. There's pressure, expectation, and suddenly her body goes into fight or flight mode. But here's the thing. Elsa can't fight, and she definitely can't flee. She's trapped. So what does her nervous system do? It freezes. Literally. Now, you might be thinking, come on, it's just Disney magic. But hear me out. The way the animators designed this scene is psychologically brilliant. Watch her breathing. It's shallow and rapid. Her shoulders are hunched defensively. She's scanning the crowd like she's looking for threats. This isn't magical overwhelm, folks. This is trauma, but where did this trauma come from? Well, let's rewind to that childhood accident with Anna. Everyone remembers the scene. Little Elsa accidentally strikes Anna with her ice powers during play. Anna nearly loses her life, and their parents rush her to the trolls for healing. Simple magical mishap, right? Wrong. What if this wasn't just an accident, but the moment Elsa's entire psychological foundation cracked? Think about what actually happened in that moment. Elsa, probably around 8 years old, genuinely believed she had ended her sister's life. For a child, that level of guilt and terror doesn't just disappear when the trolls fix everything. The damage was already done. Not to Anna's body, but to Elsa's mind. Here's where it gets really dark, though. How did her parents respond to this trauma? Did they get Elsa therapy? Did they help her process what happened? Did they reassure her that accidents happen and she's still a good person? No, they locked her away. Conceal, don't feel, don't let them know. Those aren't just lyrics, people. That's a prescription for psychological disaster. Elsa's parents, probably out of their own fear and helplessness, taught their traumatized 8-year-old daughter that her emotions were dangerous, that her authentic self was a threat, and that love could only be earned through perfect control. You know what psychologists call this? Emotional invalidation. And it's toxic. Let me paint you a picture of what Elsa's childhood actually looked like after that night. She wakes up every morning carrying the weight of nearly losing her sister. She's told her feelings are dangerous. She's isolated from everyone, including Anna, who doesn't even remember why her sister suddenly became distant. Elsa is essentially serving a life sentence for a childhood accident, and the worst part? She believes she deserves it. Here's what really breaks my heart about this whole setup. Elsa learns that love equals danger. Every time she feels joy, affection, or connection, her powers respond. So her brain starts creating this twisted association. Caring about people puts them at risk. The solution? Stop caring, stop feeling, become emotionally numb. But here's the psychological truth that Disney actually got right, whether they meant to or not. Emotional suppression doesn't work. It never works. When you try to shut down difficult emotions like fear, guilt, and anger, you end up shutting down all emotions, including joy, love, and connection. Elsa doesn't just have ice powers she can't control. She has a human heart she's been taught to fear. Look at how the animators showed this throughout the movie. Elsa moves like someone who's afraid of her own body. Her gestures are contained, controlled, minimal. She barely makes eye contact. When she does touch something, she's hyper-aware of the contact, ready to pull away. This isn't royal dignity, folks. This is someone who's been conditioned to believe that her very presence is dangerous. And those gloves? Everyone thinks they're about controlling magic, but what if they're actually security blankets? Think about it. When you're a kid dealing with overwhelming anxiety, you grab onto transitional objects. Blankets, stuffed animals, anything that feels safe. For Elsa, those gloves became her psychological anchor. As long as she's wearing them, she can pretend she has control. But control is an illusion when you're dealing with trauma. The harder you grip, the more likely everything is to slip through your fingers. And that's exactly what happens at the coronation. You want to know why Elsa's powers explode outward when Anna announces her engagement to Hans? It's not about the magic, it's about the psychological pressure cooker finally reaching its breaking point. For years, Elsa has been the good daughter, the controlled one, the one who sacrifices everything to keep everyone safe. And suddenly, Anna, sweet, impulsive Anna, is making a life-changing decision without thinking it through, and Elsa can't protect her. All those years of suppressed fear, guilt, and helplessness come rushing to the surface at once. Her nervous system can't handle it anymore. The facade cracks, the gloves come off, and everyone sees what Elsa has spent her entire life hiding. Not just ice powers, but the raw, unprocessed trauma of a child who never learned she was worthy of love. But here's where most people miss the real psychological bomb that Disney dropped. This trauma didn't just affect Elsa's relationship with magic or with herself. It completely warped her understanding of family, responsibility, and what love actually means. And that's where things get really complicated. Okay, so we've established that Elsa's childhood was basically a masterclass in how to create psychological trauma. But here's what really gets me. The way Disney showed us exactly how that trauma evolved into a full-blown anxiety disorder, and most of us completely missed it. Let's talk about Elsa's room for a second. You remember it, right? Sparse, cold, minimal furniture, barely any personal items. Most people think it's just showing us she's got ice powers, but honestly, that room is a perfect psychological portrait of someone with severe anxiety and agoraphobia. Here's what I noticed when I really looked at that space. Everything in Elsa's room is positioned for quick escape routes. The bed is against the wall so no one can approach from behind. The desk faces the door. There are no mirrors because people with trauma often can't bear to look at themselves. And most telling of all, there's nothing breakable. Think about that for a minute. This is a princess's room, but there are no delicate vases, no jewelry boxes, no decorative items that could shatter if her powers got out of control. Elsa has literally designed her living space around the assumption that she will inevitably hurt something or someone. That's not ice magic planning, folks. That's anxiety architecture. But here's where it gets really psychologically complex. Notice how Elsa relates to objects versus people throughout the movie. She can create intricate ice sculptures, beautiful snowflakes, elaborate crystal structures. Her control over inanimate things is actually pretty impressive. But the moment another human being enters the equation, everything falls apart. What if I told you this is textbook anxiety behavior? When you've been taught that your emotions are dangerous, you start preferring things to people because things can't reject you, can't judge you, and, most importantly, can't get hurt by your feelings. Elsa's entire world becomes about managing risk, and people are just too risky. Those gloves aren't just magical suppressors. They're what psychologists call safety behaviors. You know how some people with social anxiety always carry their phones so they have something to do with their hands? Or how people with panic disorder always know where the nearest exit is? Elsa's gloves serve the same psychological function. They're her security blanket, her illusion of control in a world that feels completely chaotic. Here's what really blew my mind when I started thinking about this, though. Watch Elsa's body language throughout the first part of the movie. She's constantly checking her environment, scanning for threats that aren't actually there. Her shoulders are always tense, ready to defend or flee. She startles at sudden noises. She avoids physical contact even when it's loving or comforting. This isn't magical anxiety, people. This is hypervigilance. This is what happens when your nervous system gets stuck in survival mode for years on end. But here's the cruel irony that Disney actually nailed. The harder Elsa tries to control her emotions, the more volatile they become. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The more pressure you apply, the more explosive it becomes when it finally breaks free. Think about every magical outburst in the movie. They don't happen when Elsa is calm and controlled. They happen when she's overwhelmed, stressed, or emotionally activated. Her anxiety literally creates the very thing she's trying to prevent. It's a psychological feedback loop that keeps getting worse. And you know what makes this even more tragic? Anna has no idea what she's dealing with. Imagine being a kid and your sister suddenly becomes this distant, fearful person who won't play with you, won't touch you, won't even look at you most of the time. Anna interprets this as rejection, but what she's actually witnessing is her sister having a decades-long anxiety episode. Here's where I think Disney accidentally created one of the most accurate portrayals of what it's like to live with someone who has severe anxiety. Anna tries everything: being cheerful, being persistent, being understanding, being frustrated. Nothing works because the problem isn't Anna's approach. The problem is that Elsa's nervous system has been hijacked by trauma. Watch the "Do you want to build a snowman" sequence again, but this time focus on what's happening psychologically. Every year Anna knocks on that door, and every year Elsa has to choose between risking human connection and staying safe in isolation. Every single time the anxiety wins. The fear of causing harm is stronger than the desire for love. But here's what really gets me about this whole setup. Elsa thinks she's protecting Anna, but she's actually creating a different kind of harm. Anna grows up feeling rejected, unwanted, and confused about why her sister stopped loving her. It's like Elsa's trauma created a ripple effect that damaged Anna's ability to trust and form healthy relationships too. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what about when she finally loses control at the coronation? Doesn't that prove her fears were justified? And honestly, that's exactly the wrong way to look at it. What happens at the coronation isn't proof that Elsa's emotions are dangerous. It's proof that emotional suppression doesn't work. When you spend years bottling up fear, guilt, anger, and grief, eventually that pressure has to go somewhere. The explosion isn't the problem. The years of suppression that led to the explosion are the problem. Here's the psychological truth that took me way too long to realize. Elsa's control was never actually control. It was avoidance. And avoidance just makes anxiety stronger over time. Every time Elsa successfully avoided a situation that triggered her anxiety, her brain recorded that as proof that the situation was actually dangerous. Every time she wore the gloves and nothing bad happened, her brain thought, see, the gloves are what kept us safe. Every time she stayed isolated and no one got hurt, her anxiety whispered, this is the only way to protect people. But that's not how anxiety recovery works. You can't heal from trauma by avoiding everything that scares you. You have to gradually, safely, with support, learn that the things you fear aren't actually as dangerous as your nervous system believes they are. And that's where Elsa's story gets really interesting, because what happens next isn't magical liberation like everyone thinks. What happens next is actually a manic episode disguised as empowerment, and most people completely miss the psychological red flags. All right, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say the ice castle on the mountain. Because honestly, I think Let It Go might be one of the most misunderstood songs in Disney history. And what I'm about to tell you is going to completely change how you hear it. Everyone thinks this song is about liberation, right? Freedom, self-acceptance, finally being authentic. But here's what I noticed when I really listened to the lyrics and watched Elsa's behavior. This isn't healing. This is what psychologists call a manic episode. Think about it. Elsa goes from years of rigid control and emotional suppression to suddenly declaring that nothing matters, throwing caution to the wind, and building an elaborate palace in one night. Her mood swings from devastating shame to grandiose confidence in the span of a few hours. She's not processing her trauma. She's avoiding it in a completely different way. Let it go, let it go. Can't hold it back anymore. You know what that sounds like to me? Someone who's been white-knuckling through life finally snapping and swinging to the opposite extreme. It's not balance, it's another form of dysregulation. Here's where this gets really psychologically complex, though. Watch what Elsa actually does during this song. She doesn't go find Anna. She doesn't return to fix the damage she's caused. She doesn't try to work through her fears or heal her relationships. Instead, she builds a castle. Alone. On a mountain. Where no one can reach her. This isn't liberation, folks. This is the most beautiful isolation chamber Disney has ever animated. But here's what really gets me about this whole sequence. Look at how perfect everything is. The castle is flawless. Her dress transformation is flawless. Her hair is flawless. Even her magical abilities are suddenly flawless. You know what this reminds me of? The way people with perfectionism and deep shame create these elaborate facades to hide how broken they feel inside. Elsa doesn't learn to accept her flaws during Let It Go. She just creates a new version of perfection to perform. Instead of the perfect princess who never makes mistakes, she becomes the perfect ice queen who doesn't need anyone. It's still a performance. just a different costume. And honestly, this makes so much sense when you think about Elsa's psychology. She spent her entire life believing that her worth comes from not causing problems, not making mistakes, not being a burden. When that strategy fails catastrophically at the coronation, her brain doesn't think, maybe I should learn to be human and make mistakes. Her brain thinks, I need to be perfect at being alone instead. Here's what I think is really happening in Elsa's mind during this song. She's not embracing her authentic self. She's creating a new false self that feels safer. The anxious, controlled princess didn't work, so now she's trying on the confident, independent Ice Queen. But both versions are just masks designed to avoid the terrifying possibility of being genuinely vulnerable with another person. You want to know how I know this? Look at what happens the moment Anna shows up at the ice castle. All of Elsa's newfound confidence completely evaporates. She's immediately back to, stay away from me. I don't want to hurt you. You need to leave. The let it go persona was just another anxiety management strategy, and it falls apart the second it's actually tested. But here's where this psychological analysis gets really dark. The ice castle isn't just beautiful isolation. It's a perfect metaphor for how people with deep shame and perfectionism trap themselves. Everything looks amazing from the outside. The architecture is stunning. The craftsmanship is flawless. The whole thing seems magical and enviable. But it's still a prison. Elsa has created the most gorgeous jail cell in Disney history, and she's convinced herself it's freedom. Now, you might be thinking, but at least she's using her powers instead of hiding them. And sure, that's something. But here's what I noticed about how Elsa uses her magic in the castle. It's still all about control and perfection. She's not experimenting, playing, or exploring her abilities in a healthy way. She's demonstrating mastery. Every ice sculpture is precise. Every snowflake is symmetrical. Every architectural detail is calculated. This isn't someone who's learned to embrace their authentic self, imperfections and all. This is someone who's found a new way to perform perfection. And you know what the most heartbreaking part is? Elsa still believes deep down that she's fundamentally flawed and dangerous. The whole let it go sequence is really her saying, fine, if I'm going to be a monster, I'll be a beautiful, powerful, untouchable monster. She's not healing her shame. She's just finding a way to live with it that feels less suffocating. Here's where I think Disney accidentally created something psychologically brilliant, though. Because this is exactly what high-functioning depression and anxiety look like in real life. People who learn to manage their mental health struggles by becoming super successful, super independent, super capable. From the outside, everything looks amazing. But inside, they're still running from the same fears, just with better coping mechanisms. Elsa's ice castle is like when someone with attachment trauma becomes a workaholic, or when someone with social anxiety becomes a perfectionist overachiever. It looks like success, but it's actually just a more sophisticated form of avoidance. But here's what really blew my mind when I started thinking about this whole setup. Elsa's relationship with her powers mirrors her relationship with love perfectly. She can create beautiful, impressive displays of magic, but she can't handle gentle, intimate connection. She can build elaborate structures, but she can't touch another person without fear. She can perform amazing feats, but she can't accept that someone might love her just for being human. The powers aren't the problem, and they never were. The problem is that Elsa has been taught to believe that love has to be earned through perfect performance, and that she's fundamentally too dangerous or flawed to deserve it naturally. And honestly, this is where the story gets really psychologically complex. Because what we're looking at isn't just individual trauma. What we're looking at is a family system that's been completely broken by fear. And Elsa's isolation is just one symptom of a much bigger problem. Okay, here's where this whole psychological analysis is about to get really uncomfortable. Because what I'm about to tell you about Elsa and Anna's family is going to change everything you thought you knew about their story. You ready for this? Elsa wasn't just traumatized by her accident with Anna. She was parentified. And Anna wasn't just the fun-loving sister, she was scapegoated. This isn't a story about magical sisters learning to love each other. This is a story about two children trying to survive a fundamentally dysfunctional family system. Let me explain what I mean by parentification, because this concept is going to blow your mind. Parentification happens when a child is forced to take on adult emotional responsibilities that they're not developmentally ready for. Instead of being protected and cared for by their parents, they become the caretaker of the family's emotional needs. And honestly, that's exactly what happened to Elsa after the accident. Think about it. When little Elsa accidentally hurt Anna, who was responsible for managing everyone's fear and trauma? Was it the king and queen, the actual adults in the situation? Nope. It was 8-year-old Elsa. She became responsible for ensuring that her dangerous emotions never hurt anyone again. She became responsible for protecting Anna, protecting her parents, protecting the entire kingdom from her own feelings. That's not a child's job, folks. That's an impossible burden that no kid should ever carry. But here's where this gets really twisted. The king and queen essentially told Elsa, "Your feelings are so dangerous that the safety of everyone we love depends on you controlling them perfectly." What kind of pressure is that to put on a child? What kind of message does that send about her worth as a person? Elsa learned that love was conditional on her perfect emotional performance. She learned that other people's well-being was more important than her own needs. She learned that she was fundamentally responsible for managing everyone else's comfort and safety. Classic parentification. And while Elsa was being turned into the family's emotional caretaker, what was happening to Anna? She was being cast as the identified patient, the problem child whose needs and feelings were treated as less important than maintaining the family's fragile stability. Here's what I noticed when I really thought about Anna's childhood. She's constantly being told no, being shut out, being denied explanations, being treated like her very reasonable need for connection and understanding is somehow selfish or demanding. She's not the problem, but she's being treated like she is. You want to know why Anna chases love so frantically as an adult? Why she's ready to marry Hans after one day? Why she's so desperate for connection that she'll latch onto literally anyone who shows her attention? It's because she spent her entire childhood being emotionally starved while being told that her hunger for love was the problem. And you want to know why Elsa rejects love even when it's offered freely? Because she spent her entire life believing that accepting love puts other people at risk. She can't receive care because she's been trained to be the caretaker. This is textbook family dysfunction, people. One child becomes the over-responsible caretaker who sacrifices everything for others. The other child becomes the under-responsible problem who acts out their unmet needs in increasingly desperate ways. Both roles are trauma responses to the same broken system. But here's where this analysis gets really heartbreaking. Look at that funeral scene when their parents perish in the storm. 2 children, completely alone, processing the most devastating event of their lives. And how do they handle it? Exactly according to their dysfunctional family roles. Elsa becomes even more withdrawn and controlled, taking on even more responsibility for protecting Anna from her own grief and fear. Anna becomes even more desperate for connection, literally singing outside Elsa's door about how alone and confused she feels. Neither of them gets to just be a grieving child who needs comfort and support. Think about that for a minute. Their parents are gone, and instead of coming together to support each other through their shared loss, they retreat even further into their assigned roles. Elsa thinks she has to be strong enough to protect Anna from everything, including her own emotions. Anna thinks she has to be understanding enough to not burden Elsa with her needs. Honestly, this funeral scene might be the most psychologically accurate portrayal of childhood grief I've ever seen in a Disney movie, and it's devastating. But here's what really gets me about this whole setup. By the time we get to the coronation, we're not just watching Elsa have a panic attack about being queen. We're watching the moment when years of unprocessed family trauma finally explodes into the open. The coronation represents everything that's been broken in this family system. Elsa is being asked to take on ultimate responsibility, again, to perform perfectly under pressure, again, to manage everyone else's needs while ignoring her own, again, and Anna, desperate for connection and completely unaware of the psychological landmines she's walking through, makes a decision that feels threatening to Elsa's sense of control. When Anna announces her engagement to Hans, she's not just making a romantic choice. She's unconsciously acting out her role as the impulsive problem child who makes decisions that the responsible caretaker has to fix. And Elsa, who spent her entire life feeling responsible for Anna's safety and well-being, can't handle the possibility that she might not be able to protect her sister from this choice. The magical explosion isn't really about ice powers. It's about a parentified child finally reaching the breaking point of carrying responsibilities that were never hers to begin with. And you know what's really twisted about this? Even after everything falls apart, even after Elsa flees to the mountain and Anna goes after her, they're still playing out these same dysfunctional roles. Elsa is still trying to protect Anna by pushing her away. Anna is still chasing after someone who's emotionally unavailable, convinced that if she just tries hard enough, she can fix the relationship. Here's where the frozen heart metaphor becomes really psychologically interesting, though. Everyone thinks it's about magical curses, but what if it's actually about emotional numbness? What if Anna's frozen heart represents what happens when someone who's been emotionally starved for years finally starts shutting down? Think about Anna's journey in the second half of the movie. She's exhausted from chasing love that always seems just out of reach. She's betrayed by Hans, who confirms her worst fears about being unlovable. She's rejected by Elsa, who tells her that love isn't enough to fix their problems. At what point does someone in Anna's position just stop trying? The frozen heart isn't a magical curse. It's what happens when someone's capacity for hope and connection finally starts to shut down as a protective mechanism. But here's what Disney actually got psychologically right about trauma recovery. Individual healing isn't enough when you're dealing with family system dysfunction. Elsa can't just learn to control her powers. Anna can't just learn to make better romantic choices. They have to fundamentally change the way they relate to each other and break the dysfunctional patterns they learned in childhood. And that's exactly what the climax of the movie is really about. So here we are at the climax of Frozen. And I'm about to tell you why this ending is actually one of the most psychologically sophisticated portrayals of trauma recovery Disney has ever created, even if they didn't necessarily mean to do it. Because here's the thing that most people miss about Anna's sacrifice. When she chooses to save Elsa instead of letting Kristoff save her, she's not just making a heroic gesture. She's breaking a generational pattern of dysfunctional family dynamics that's been destroying both of them for years. Think about what Anna's choice actually represents psychologically. For the first time in her life, she's not chasing after someone who's emotionally unavailable, trying to earn love through persistence and self-sacrifice. She's not playing the role of the problem child who needs to be rescued. Instead, she's making a conscious choice to prioritize someone else's well-being, not because she's been programmed to be the family scapegoat, but because she genuinely loves her sister and wants to break the cycle of harm. And honestly, that's what real trauma recovery looks like. It's not about individual healing in isolation. It's about learning to create healthier patterns of connection and breaking the cycles that keep families stuck in dysfunction. But here's what really gets me about this scene. Elsa's reaction to Anna's sacrifice. When she realizes that Anna chose to save her, even knowing it would cost Anna her life, something fundamental shifts in Elsa's psychology. For the first time, she experiences unconditional love. Not love that has to be earned through perfect behavior, not love that depends on never making mistakes, but love that exists even when you're at your absolute worst. You want to know why Anna's sacrifice thaws Elsa's frozen heart? It's not magical. It's attachment theory in action. When someone who's been programmed to believe they're fundamentally unlovable finally experiences genuine unconditional acceptance, it literally rewires their nervous system. The trauma that taught them they were dangerous starts to heal because they have evidence that someone can love them completely and survive the experience. But here's where I think Disney got something really psychologically important, right? The healing doesn't happen instantly. Elsa doesn't just hug Anna and suddenly all her trauma disappears. What happens is that she finally understands what love actually means. And that understanding gives her a completely different relationship with her own emotions and powers. Love will thaw a frozen heart. Everyone thinks this is about romantic love, but honestly, I think it's about something much deeper. It's about the kind of love that doesn't ask you to be perfect, that doesn't require you to manage other people's feelings, that doesn't make your worth conditional on your performance. It's about being seen and accepted for who you actually are, not who you think you need to be to earn approval. And you know what's psychologically brilliant about what happens next? Elsa doesn't just go back to being the controlled, anxious princess she was before. She doesn't retreat back to isolation either. Instead, she finds a middle ground: connection with boundaries, intimacy with self-awareness, power with responsibility. Watch how Elsa moves and interacts with people in the final scenes of the first movie. She's still careful, still mindful of her impact on others, but she's not paralyzed by fear anymore. She can touch Anna without panic. She can use her powers playfully instead of just defensively. She can be present with people without constantly scanning for threats or managing everyone else's emotions. This isn't magical transformation, folks. This is what psychological healing actually looks like. Gradual, imperfect, requiring ongoing conscious choice and practice. But here's where this whole analysis gets really interesting. What Frozen 2 tells us about the ongoing nature of trauma recovery. Because honestly, the sequel confirms everything I've been talking about. Elsa's journey isn't finished just because she learned that love doesn't require perfect control. She still has to deal with generational trauma, family secrets, and the ongoing work of figuring out who she is when she's not defined by her fears. You know what I love about Frozen 2 from a psychological perspective? It shows us that healing isn't a destination, it's a process. Elsa doesn't just get better and stay better. She has to keep making conscious choices to face her fears, to stay connected with people who matter to her, to use her abilities in ways that serve rather than isolate. And Anna? She has to learn that being supportive doesn't mean enabling, that love sometimes requires letting people make their own choices even when those choices scare you. She has to develop her own sense of identity beyond being the sister who chases after Elsa. Honestly, this is what real family recovery looks like. It's messy, it's ongoing, it requires both people to keep showing up and doing the work, even when it's uncomfortable. Here's what really blows my mind about this whole psychological reading of Frozen, though. When you understand Elsa's story as a trauma recovery narrative, instead of just a magical princess story, it becomes so much more relatable and meaningful. Because how many of us have felt like our emotions were too big, too dangerous, too much for other people to handle? How many of us learned to perform perfection as a way to earn love? How many of us have had to learn the difference between isolation and healthy boundaries? Elsa's story stops being about having magical ice powers and starts being about learning to trust that you can be fully human, messy, imperfect, occasionally overwhelming, and still be worthy of love and connection. And that's actually revolutionary for a Disney princess story. Because most fairy tales are about external transformation, finding the right prince, defeating the evil witch, getting the magical happy ending. But Elsa's story is about internal transformation, healing trauma, developing emotional regulation, learning to form healthy relationships. You want to know why Frozen resonated with so many adults, not just kids? Because it's not really a children's story about magic. It's a story about psychological healing that happens to use magical metaphors to make complex therapeutic concepts accessible. Think about how many other Disney characters might be carrying hidden psychological depth that we've never really examined. What trauma is Belle trying to heal by falling in love with a literal beast? What attachment wounds drive Ariel's desperate need to completely transform herself for love? What family dysfunction created the evil queen's obsession with being the fairest of them all? Honestly, when you start looking at Disney stories through a psychological lens, you realize that these aren't just entertainment for children. They're cultural myths that help us process some of the deepest human experiences: trauma, healing, family dysfunction, the search for authentic love and acceptance. And maybe that's why Elsa's story feels so powerful. Not because she has ice powers, but because she shows us that it's possible to heal from childhood trauma, break dysfunctional family patterns, and learn to love and be loved authentically, even when the process is messy, scary, and takes longer than we'd like. Because at the end of the day, that's the real magic. Not the ability to create ice castles, but the courage to keep choosing connection over isolation, vulnerability over performance, and healing over hiding. And honestly, that's a kind of magic we could all use a little more of in our lives.